So welcome back to this afternoon session. We now are going to have our second keynote speech, which is Graham Watson. Many of my students should know who he is because I talked to him about. And Graham was the first, for those that are in Western Europe, was the first British, Scottish, doesn't matter, person who was able to gain a seat as a Liberal on the European Parliament, despite the majoritarian first parts of the post-electoral system. In the Parliament, he created a climate alliance and led it. And today he's environmentalist in residence at the Monk School, actually the Honors College of the Monk School in Toronto.
Okay, Federica, thank you very much. It's great to be with you guys. Apologies if I don't look too pretty at the moment. I was trying to be climate conscious cycling to work, and I came off my bicycle quite spectacularly. Federica makes me sound, in her kind introduction, like a distinguished politician. Actually, I'm an extinguished politician. I served 20 years in the European Parliament, and then I was defeated by the neocons who have taken over my country. You guys have got some experience of neocons, so you know what it's all about. I want to start in talking to you today with the scientific understanding of climate change. Now, most of you will be aware of it, but I think it bears repeating. And then I will talk about what we're doing to stop it. And finally, I'll talk about what more we need to do to succeed. Okay? Look there. Ever since the agricultural revolution, 12,000 years ago, we have been controlling the way that animals live and the type of plants that grow around us. Why? Because we wanted to settle down in one place and ensure we had enough food to eat, rather than having to be constantly on the move in search of meat or fish or fruit or vegetables in the way in which the hunter-gatherer societies had done. In the Industrial Revolution, much more recently, we started to burn fossil fuels to produce energy for cooking, for heating our homes, for transportation, for building in brick or in steel or in plastics. And while there were relatively few of us, this was not particularly critical. But if you look at the graph of world population since just before the Industrial Revolution, you can see that we've moved from less than 1 billion people to 250 years ago to almost 8 billion people today. And what has that meant? It's meant that the discoveries of the agricultural revolution and the Industrial Revolution, the way we farm and the way we produce energy, have rapidly increased the emission of gases into the thin layer of the atmosphere around the Earth, faster than nature can absorb them. The rearing of animals has increased carbon dioxide and methane emissions massively. Up to 35% of all emissions at the moment come from agriculture. Mining and burning of fossil fuels creates at least 65% of climate change. And this has caused global warming, and you can see what has happened as CO2 in the atmosphere has gone up. Average temperatures have gone up by over 1 degree centigrade. There are rising sea levels, and the ice caps are melting. The next graph shows you, sorry, did I? Yeah, okay, that's concentration of gases. The graph shows you the concentration of gases, all greenhouse gases expressed in CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere today. And those gases create what is called the greenhouse effect. In other words, just like a greenhouse, they stop the heat from the sun escaping back through the atmosphere. As more and more people are doing more and more things which pump more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the global warming that we are causing is killing the life in our oceans, changing our weather patterns. Increasingly, we are seeing violent storms, flooding, wildfires, droughts, which are making life on Earth more hazardous and less sustainable. And over the last 70 years, scientists have been warning us that we cannot go on like this. There is now an overwhelming consensus in the scientific community, almost unanimity, that human-induced changes to the climate are threatening the very survival of our species on the planet. We now see extreme climate events that we used to think of as natural disasters as being woman-made, or man-made, of course. Who's responsible? Well, this graph shows the greenhouse gas emissions expressed in carbon dioxide terms from each of the most polluting countries. You can see that China is the biggest. The United States, actually, if you put all the European countries together, comes to about the same as the United States. And you've got relatively smaller amounts still, but growing amounts from India and Japan and so on. Now, you might say, of course, these countries do more damage to the environment because they're bigger. Well, total greenhouse gas emissions per capita show you who's actually most responsible. I mean, if you look, for example, at the USA and in Europe, the total emissions from the European Union are slightly higher than they are from the USA, but then the population is 1/3 larger. Per capita, they are much lower. The biggest polluter per capita is Saudi Arabia, followed closely by the United States, then Canada, then Australia, and so on, all the way down. The onus is on the most polluting countries to act quickly. Climate change deniers will tell you that global warming is not the fault of humans, it is a natural phenomenon, that the planet's climate has been evolving over millions of years. And it's true, there have been prolonged ice ages, which killed off the dinosaurs and other forms of animal and plant life, and there have been periods of great heat. But actually, for the last 130,000 years or so, in other words, from the time when Homo sapiens evolved in sub-Saharan Africa and started to migrate and replaced earlier species like the Neanderthals, the Earth's climate has been remarkably stable. It has favored human development. The seasons have been predictable. They brought the sunshine and the rain that we need to grow crops. And apart from the deserts and the polar ice caps, our environment has been quite hospitable. We now know that all of this is changing, and it is changing horrifically fast. And unless America and Europe act rapidly and decisively within the next 12 years, our species is probably doomed. We need the Chinese to do so as well, and they are. Climate change could become disastrous, and we will no longer be able to stop it because we will pass the tipping points at which nature begins to work against us. Now, you know, as far as most of us are concerned, you can sum up the effects of climate change in just 9 words. Water. Too much, too little, wrong time, wrong place. That's what climate change is doing to us. And you know, as winter sports professionals, what impact this is having on your industry. It's killing it. There's not enough snow. There's not enough water to make artificial snow. Look at the throughput of the Colorado River in recent years and how much the water level has reduced. If you go to the website Save Our Snow, you can see how many resorts are opening late or closing early. And you can see that within very few years, outdoor skiing could be a thing of the past. The good news is that we can stop global warming. And if we do so soon enough, within the next 12 years, the planet will start to cool again. The polar ice caps will stop melting. They will start to freeze once more, and the snow will come back in the temperate regions. We already have the ability, and by that I mean both the scientific knowledge and the technology, to stop the global warming which is depriving us of snow. More and more people in the winter sports industry, as we've heard this morning, are doing whatever they can to decarbonize, to cut their carbon footprint, and we've heard some good examples. But it's not enough. We also need to lead by example in our private lives. And in fact, in a democracy, that is the most powerful form of leadership there is. We can change our diet to eat less meat and dairy products and more plant-based food. We can stop burning fossil fuels and use renewable energy instead. The sun's warmth gives us more energy every hour than we need to produce all of our power needs for a whole year. According to the US Department, sorry, I don't need to get into the statistics. The question is, will we do this? Will we change our diet? Will we stop using fossil fuels? Well, the situation is not entirely bad. 8 years ago, at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Paris, all of the world's leaders signed a treaty pledging to do what it takes to stop global warming by 2050. Actually, it was a triumph, particularly for two people, a man called Nick Stern from the United Kingdom and a man called Al Gore from the United States of America. They were assisted by many others, but they got that conference together. The only trouble is that the following year, Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, and he took the USA out of the Paris Agreement. Europeans and others made pretty good progress for 4 years. The European Union has legislated to cut greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030, very ambitious target, and to be climate neutral by 2050. China is spending over $3 billion that it committed to spend, even though the United States has dropped its pledge to spend the same amount. In 2020, 5 years after Paris, Joe Biden defeated Trump and he pledged to put the USA back on course. But by then we'd been hit by a coronavirus pandemic and then by wars in Ukraine and in Palestine. And you know, it's in the nature of politics that you concentrate not on what seems most important, but on what appears most urgent. And the challenges of the transition to a sustainable lifestyle, not least the cost of making the transition, are also slowing down the action that we need on climate. Countries like my country, the United Kingdom, which were leading in the fight against climate change, are now beginning to renege on the commitments that they made at that meeting in Paris. And countries like China and India are asking the question, well, if the rich countries won't continue to make the sacrifices necessary, why should we? Hands up everyone who's seen this movie. Okay, quite a lot of you. I guess you might have done. It's a great movie. It's about a meteor. Well, actually, it's not. It's a movie that you go to see if you want to let your brain rot for 2 hours, okay? It's about a meteorite that is hurtling through space on a collision course with the Earth. And at first, people look up at it in awe, this bright light in the sky as it approaches. They talk about how to protect themselves. There's a mass movement with the slogan, "Look up." And then increasingly, they become preoccupied with other things and they turn away in denial. And some of them start a counter movement called "Don't Look Up," which is the title of the movie. Well, you know, it's a simple allegory. Although more and more people understand the science of climate change and what we are doing to our planet, more and more people are becoming climate change deniers. Anybody hear what Donald Trump was saying last Tuesday? He said that he would scrap the American legislation which aims at transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's a misnomer. It's actually about the green energy transition. Similar voices are being heard from some governments across Europe. Now, in that movie, the president of the USA is a woman, played by Meryl Streep. And at the end of the film, just as the Earth is about to explode, she flies off to another planet where she gets eaten by a dinosaur. Not saying I would wish that fate on anybody in the United States at the moment, but I hope the next president of the most powerful nation on earth is going to be a responsible person, like the current one, and somebody who's not going to leave the planet without tackling the problem. But the fact is, guys, whatever our governments are doing, it's actually no good waiting for the politicians. The solution to climate change is actually simple. Stop eating meat and dairy, or at least less of them. Eat less of them, particularly beef. I'm sorry to say this after such wonderful sandwiches, but actually, we've got to eat a hell of a lot less beef. It's not hard to do.
There was also vegetarian sandwich.
There were also vegetarian sandwiches. That way, we can also stop cutting down the world's rainforests, which are storing carbon and which are being cut down to grow animal feed for beef cattle instead. We can stop burning oil and coal and gas and use the wind and the sun instead. If you have to use a car, make it an electric car. It's fairly simple. But although the solutions are simple, it's not going to be easy. Why? Because the global fossil fuel companies and global agribusiness have a lot of money at stake, and they can buy a lot of influence. And they are already fighting tooth and nail to prevent the necessary changes. We've heard today about the winter sports industry. It's become a big business. It's growing by over 3.5% a year. It's estimated to be worth over $5.5 billion worldwide. But the total value of agribusiness is over $5.5 trillion worldwide, and fossil fuel not far behind. In other words, they're worth more than 20 times what the winter sports industry is worth. So the people causing the problem are carrying far more clout in national capitals than some of the people who want to stop the problem. But I'll say something about my experience in politics for 20 years in the European Parliament. And that is that while, if you want to predict what's going to happen in government, you can be fairly sure that economic interests will set the stage, it is also the case that it's human emotions which determine the script. How did we stop the tobacco industry? We shamed them. We put nasty labels on cigarette packets. And people have started to shame the oil industry. We've not got there with agribusiness yet. And people have started to protest in large numbers about the destruction of the only planet we have. Now, democratic governments rely on public support. They don't like to do unpopular things. And in the case of climate change, there are some things they will not do for us. They won't legislate to ban hamburgers. They won't legislate to ban the use of cars where alternatives exist, although some of our cities are beginning to do that. They can only do these things with us. So our dilemma is summed up in the words of a great American author called Mark Twain. He says, we can change the world or ourselves, but the latter is more difficult. We have never, in the whole history of humankind, faced a challenge like this. We can overcome it, but only if we change our own habits and behavior and persuade our families and our friends and our fellow human beings to do the same. Thank you.
Do you think advances in lab-grown meats are promising for combating global warming?
I think any scientific discovery is promising, but be careful with lab-grown meat. There's a report came out, I think I read it in the International New York Times yesterday, might have been the Financial Times, that the amount of carbon produced by growing lab-grown meat is probably more than producing meat on the normal way. Yeah.
Now, several of the students here are in EU-related classes. So the EU went into the Copenhagen summit as the leader. It came out as the net loser. It never really recovered.
Yeah.
So what is your take on what the EU is doing, what it should be doing? So
Yeah. I think one of the challenges is this: we made a lot of progress at the Paris COP. Didn't get very much publicity at the time, because just as it was happening, there was a major terrorist attack in Paris, and that tended to dominate the headlines. But actually, a lot of progress was made. Since then, we've tried to build on that by getting more and more countries to make more and more commitments every year. And we've also had reports from the scientists in the meantime that have shown us that the problem is a little bit worse than we thought it was. In other words, the ice caps are melting rather faster than we thought was the case. The European Union, I think it's not unfair to say, was leading the process in terms of it was the economic bloc that was doing the most to stop it. Its attention was taken off this after 2016, firstly by the Brits voting to leave the European Union and the whole process of Brexit, and then by COVID and the war. And in the meantime, some governments have been elected in Europe who are climate change deniers in 3 or 4 European countries. So we've got the same problem that we had in the States between 2016 and 2020. All I would say is there are still a hell of a lot of people in powerful positions in government who recognize how serious the problem is and are trying to do it. But if the public are voting for governments who don't share this, then things look pretty grim. And when I said we have 12 years, look, we have to be doing things already. The more we can do, the better. But we really need to get to a situation by 2035 where we are almost climate neutral. And by 2050, we certainly need to be climate neutral. Otherwise, we're going to see really serious problems in the meantime. If we want to be able to reverse, in other words, well, let me put it this way. Even if we do everything we can do, global temperatures will continue rising until about 2050. But then there is a chance, if we've done what we need to do, that they will come down again, quite a good chance, and that the ice caps will start to freeze and that the climate will gradually come back to normal, so that by the end of the century, we will be able to hand on a planet to our children and our grandchildren. If we don't do that within the next 12 years, i.e. by 2035, then that will no longer be the case. And what the scientists are predicting, the worst case scenarios come into effect. We've had a report from the United Nations Environment Programme for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that is taking place in a few days in Dubai. We've had a report saying that currently we are heading for at least 2 degrees warming of the planet, which is already substantially higher than is safe. And if we start to hit 3 degrees or more, then we're in really very serious trouble. You know, do I remain optimistic? Of course, I know what Einstein said. He said there are only 2 things that are infinite. There's the universe and there is man's stupidity. And then he added, and I'm not sure about the universe. But actually, I do remain optimistic because in the end, you know, people will vote for survival. If they are sufficiently aware of the challenges, they will vote to survive. And, you know, I'm a liberal. I'm an optimist by nature. We can do it. It's not that difficult. The question is, can we muster the courage and the political will to get it done?
Anyone else? More questions? Silence?
Well, I'll ask this question, but I'm sure I know what your answer is. But you know, the big push right now, and you see it on TV, is the fracking push.
Yeah.
And you know, the way it's couched is that it's a better way to access. And I don't know. I just like to know your opinion of that.
Well, fracking is bad, and tar sand oil extraction is even worse because the methane emissions from it are bad. You're also doing other kinds of damage. I mean, we've got examples in Europe of fracking causing minor earthquakes You know, you've got to look at, in the end, we've got to stop taking fossil fuels out of the ground. It amazes me that the share values, the values of companies like Exxon and British Petroleum and so on, are still as high as they are, because we know that if we're to stop global warming, then 2/3 of all of the known oil reserves, oil and gas reserves, have got to stay in the ground. So their share prices should be tumbling fast, and they're not. And what that tells us is that people who are investing don't believe that governments are serious about climate change. And that is why it's more important that their citizens, that all of us, are serious about it. Even if it means that when you ride your bicycle to work, you run the risk of falling off.
Yep.
In our skiing business and ski racing business, the politics of it is we don't care about what the athletes are saying, what coaches are saying, that there's red flags going up, we need to change stuff, and they just hunker down and do it like that. It's terrible, but as a politician, how do we affect our ski racing politicians?
Do you know, I can tell you as a politician what influenced me. I used to get two types of, well, they started off as letters, which shows you how long ago I was first elected, in the 1990s. Within 5 years, 95% of all the communication I got was email. But I would get two types of email. I would get emails from organizations who wanted me to do things. And then I would get emails from the people in my constituency who might vote for me. You can guess which one I took more notice of. So actually writing to your congressman is quite an important thing to do, because if your congressman has the impression that a lot of his or her voters are concerned about climate change, then they're more likely to do something about it. One of the problems you have, I think, in the US Congress and Senate at the moment is you have a blocking minority, about 35 legislators, actually, who are able to stop any serious action against climate change. It's up to the constituents in their ridings, or the ridings, they would say in Canada, I don't know what you say in America, in their constituencies to write them and stop them. You know, public protests, one of the most important things you can do in a democracy. But in the end, the most effective form of leadership is changing your own habits.
So as we move away, as more governments try to move away from fossil fuels and non-renewable forms of energy, one of the more controversial ones that has arisen is nuclear power. Do you think that's a step in the right direction in terms of alternative energy?
I'll tell you a story. Back in 1978 was the only time I've been arrested. And I was arrested for lying down in front of the bulldozers at a site where they were trying to build a nuclear power station in Scotland. We didn't succeed, and the nuclear power station was built, and it's still running. But in the meantime, my view of nuclear power has totally changed. I don't like it for a whole series of reasons, not least that we haven't discovered how we're going to treat the waste that we're producing, which is very dangerous. But I am now convinced that nuclear power is necessary as a transition technology between being where we are and being at the situation where we can rely totally on solar and wind power. In other words, the most important thing is to stop burning fossil fuels. If we have to keep our nuclear power stations going for another 20 years, then let's do it. But in the meantime, we've got to work to put in networks of high voltage direct current electricity cabling so that we can take solar power from the areas where it is most abundant, in the deserts, and wind power from the areas where you get most of that, which is towards the poles, and transmit it to the places where you're using most energy, which are the temperate climates. But, you know, everybody can do something about this. You can put a solar panel on the roof of your garage or on the roof of your house. You know, you can change your car from being a gas run car to being a hybrid or to being an electric car. We're not, by the way, going to be able to replace all the cars on the road with electric cars on our current technology. Although 2 weeks ago, there was the announcement of a sodium-ion battery being produced in Sweden, which might just replace a lithium-ion battery, which needs far less in the way of rare earths to do it. You know, but in any case, we shouldn't be replacing all the cars. You know, they are making life in our cities hell. They're causing a lot of accidents, particularly SUVs. You get hit by an SUV, or if your child gets hit by an SUV, far more likely to be killed than they were by the smaller cars that we used to drive. You know, we should be using this to transition to more active travel and health, i.e. more walking and cycling, and to more public transport. And that way, we're going to save a lot of costs in health expenditure as well.
There was a question from the public at home. Henrik, hi, I know that we already answered. People from home, you can ask questions online as well. Sorry, I invaded your space for that. Yep, Valentina.
Do you think in the US it would be feasible to effectuate a transportation system like that of Europe? Because obviously a lot of the cities are easily approachable in Europe and you can access them.
Yeah, I mean, you have farther to go, but it's not impossible. One of the, perhaps the biggest single development in transportation in Europe in the last 30 years has been the rolling out of high-speed railway lines, which are very effective, very fast, and not really that expensive to build. And you could do the same in the States, and the Canadians could do the same. It's, you know, my wife and I are going up to Montreal next weekend, and we're going by train, and it takes taking 5 hours to go from Toronto, where I'm teaching, up to Montreal. In Europe, that journey would take less than 2 hours. Yeah, you already have a train that goes from Washington to New York in 2 hours. You could do that all over the country. Yeah, it just requires the political will to do it.
Yeah.
What do you think of hyper efficient gas cars instead of an alternative to electric cars? Because the problem with now is that our power grid is highly based on fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So you'll be getting electricity, and that would be better for the environment. But the electricity you're getting is inherently dirty because of its fossil fuel origin, while a hyper efficient gas car would be better.
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of development with LPG, with liquid petroleum gas, but in the end, you're still using gas. You know, possibly the more promising technology is one that's being looked at very closely in Europe at the moment, is actually hydrogen fuel cells, because you can make hydrogen in many different ways, and you can make it in a carbon neutral way. Okay, there are different types of, or different ways of making hydrogen, so you have to be careful which one you go for. But you can make hydrogen in a carbon neutral way, and there are already trains running in Germany which run on hydrogen fuel cells. There are already trucks that have been developed by some companies that run on hydrogen fuel cells. There's no reason in principle why you shouldn't do it in a private motor car.
Maybe just the will to do that. Yep, Nick.
So then what's like natural?
Louder.
What's natural gas like? How does that compare to like regular gas for something? Because I know some buses and stuff are now running off those, off that kind of fuel.
I think the question you're asking is, you know, among fossil fuels, which are the better? The worst is coal. Okay, burning coal or burning peat, as they still do in some parts of far west of Europe, are the worst things you can do. Burning oil comes after that, and gas is a bit cleaner than oil, although it's better to use liquid natural gas rather than the kind of gas that we used to produce in gasworks in, you know, different towns. But in the end, you're adding to the problem. You know, the more fossil fuels you're using, the less you're dealing with the serious challenge that we face. And that's why, you know, I would argue in favor of more and more technology. We have already developed cars that run on solar energy. They're not in commercial use, but they're there in laboratories. I have no doubt that we will produce airplanes that fly with hydrogen fuel technology. We're already producing airplanes that are a lot cleaner than, you know, the ones we've had up to now. So the genius of humankind, you know, the opportunities of science are fantastic. One of the reasons why I remain an optimist is that all of our plans at the moment for fighting climate change depend on existing technology. But if you look at how incredibly quickly we developed a virus, we developed a vaccine.
That was Freudian.
We developed a vaccine to fight coronavirus. You know, we are making vast steps forward in other forms of science as well. And I remain an optimist for that reason. I think if we put enough effort into it, if we engage sufficient number of our best brains, we will find a way through this.
One last question. How does it look in Europe, the fact that the US is not going to, the other question was asking before, the fact that the US is not going to attend the COP conference 28 at the highest level?
Well, you know, I find it frustrating and funny in equal measure that we always measure ourselves against each other. You know, Europeans are from Venus and Americans are from Mars, is generally the idea. And the Europeans, I'm sure, take great pleasure in criticizing the United States of America. And sometimes it goes the other way around. It wasn't that long ago that George Bush was Jr. during the war of Iraq, during the invasion of Iraq, was claiming that the French were all cheese-eating surrender monkeys. You know, we can insult each other as much as we like. The reality is Europe has taken climate change a bit more seriously hitherto, but equally, historically, it has done more damage. The United States is waking up to it. The Canadians are among the most advanced of anyone, actually, in what they're doing. We've all got to do it. We've all got to do it together. Because, as somebody said, there's no planet B.